Welcome. I appreciate you taking the time to come in and meet with us again for our second session of our, looks like about a dozen sessions to go over all of the economics of a MTSP, the Managed Technology Service Provider. I'm going to run through kind of a little bit of a summary here. We did get through one of these last week. This is our second session. Today, we're going to go through the transactional revenue. This is kind of one of the simpler building blocks of the MTSP. Typically relates most to premise-based voice and surveillance and security, where we're selling the system for a fixed price, regardless of how long it takes us to get it in the wall. And we're going to go through that today. The next few sessions, I just want to put these up here. We're going to have bundling partner plans with those fixed price contracts. Very, very important because obviously, everything we're doing, we do want to transition into a recurring revenue stream. Maximizing hourly labor. This is your project labor or sometimes T&M. You have folks that are not under a service agreement. How do we maximize the hourly labor and then standalone equipment sales as we go through those types of transactions? We'll have a couple of sessions on that. We're going to get into 2 sessions on core recurring revenues. These are some of the kind of high margin, but low touch. When I say low touch, meaning not a lot of service obligation typically. Recurring revenues that kind of everybody needs to have in their toolbox. And then we get into the kind of the more complex section of the series, which is going to be the economics of the managed IT. We're going to have 3 sessions on that, including a demo of our pricing calculator during one of those. And then we're going to finish up with the last 2 sessions getting into the kind of cloud arena with Microsoft Azure, Windows Virtual Desktop, and the economics of those offerings as well. As I mentioned in the introductory class last week, we're going to be reaching out to each one of you individually to gather some data over the next month or 2. And we're going to be ending this with a financial analysis one-on-one of your company. So whatever your business mix is, if you sell some voice, IT, surveillance, and security, any of those types of revenues, we'll be able to break that all down for you and give you some feedback as to how we think you are doing compared to our metrics. Okay? Transactional revenues, these are fixed price contract sales. What typically is that? Well, it's a bundle of equipment and installation labor at a fixed price. These are typically these new installations or what we call Big Macs, the moves, adds, and changes. If you've got a customer that's changing buildings or they're moving everything from the 3rd floor to down to the 1st floor and you're doing large wholesale kind of removal and installations. Now, typically these are going to be your premise-based surveillance and premise-based phone systems and then surveillance and access control. Now, what's different about these is this is a single transaction. We are going to address the recurring revenue that can come out of this, obviously, which is what we want in next week's session. And we're just going to look today at the economics of the single transaction of installing these large systems at a fixed price. What's different about these a little bit is that in an IT scenario, when we do a big project, we sell the end user the equipment, and then we charge for the labor to install it and configure it. Typically, we give them an estimate, but we charge for the hourly labor to do the project. These systems are different. We bid this out at a fixed price, which means we take all the risk of performance. If we estimate that a phone system is going to take 25 hours to install, sometimes if it goes smoothly, it might take 15 or 20. Other times when things go a little sideways, it might take 30 or 35. But we don't get to go back to ask the customer for any more money when that happens. Just conversely, obviously, if things go a little more smoothly, we may have budgeted 25 hours and we doesn't take as long, but we certainly don't go back to the customer with a refund and give them any money back. We take that risk of performance. It's super important that we look at this. I know a lot of folks that are on this call have their roots in the office equipment, office technology, and copier space. Some of you are getting into voice as well, so you will have an opportunity to put in premise-based phone systems. This is not hosted voice. That is a separate discussion we're going to have in a couple of weeks. So this is purely premise-based voice that we're going to talk about. And there's a huge opportunity in the surveillance world. We can't stress this enough. If you're not selling surveillance, this is something you really do need to consider. It can be profitable, and it can generate recurring revenue. The recurring revenue that these generate is very, very profitable. And there's a huge demand from SMBs, government, education, municipalities. This is just one more way you can get into being a managed technology service provider and owning all the technology of your customers. In a perfect world, what would we like to be? Well, I don't want to be known as the IT company alone. I don't want to be known as the copier company or the voice guy. We want to be a technology company that we can certainly get our hooks into our customers and manage everything that is under the sun. In a perfect world, that's what we'd like to do, is to own all that technology. We do have a huge opportunity. We do have some companies that are on this call, or at least were registered on this call, that are already selling surveillance, that have come out of the copier world. I believe Barlop and Pulse, and I think Accelerated, Mauricio, you might be starting to get into it. These are things that are going to give you the opportunity to get into something that is pretty easy to get into. There's a low barrier to entry into surveillance, and it's something you probably want to consider. And for those of us on the call that have gotten into IT, that I always kind of jokingly say this, that getting into this is certainly much easier than getting into IT, because it is. Surveillance also, I just anecdotally wanted to tell you that this is the only recession-proof product that we've seen in the history of tech. Back in 2008, 9, and 10, when really there was a bloodbath in the technology space, whether it was voice, whether it was IT, all those sales and purchases of the systems really went down. Everybody took a hit during the Great Recession, and actually the folks that sold surveillance that were in tag, their sales went up, and in some cases they went up massively. It's a good thing to look at, especially with the economy and COVID. We're still trying to get out of that. It is what we've seen in the past has been a recession-proof industry. And we are going to show you next week how to make some recurring revenue on this. Today, we're going to talk about, when we do this, how do we do it profitably? Let's kind of get into that. Remember last week we talked about contribution and how much contribution should we make when we sell a fixed price contract sale. Just for a bit of review here, the contribution, the definition of that, remember, is kind of that gross margin plus the sales expenses. It's the money we have left over after all the costs to sell and deliver our product to our customers, but before we pay that G&A expense. We talked about that last week. Think of it this way: is how much money am I going to have left over after I buy the product that I sold? I paid the guy who installed it, and then I paid the guy who sold it. And how much money do I have left before I start paying any G&A, overhead, those types of things. For these types of contracts, we should be able to contribute 20% on these before overhead. And kind of a quick breakdown, a very, very simple overview of how this typically breaks out. We're going to get a little more detailed, don't worry. But as if we have that sales price, the cost of goods on these types of transactions runs about 62%. And that includes everything, though. That's the purchase of the equipment from the wholesaler. That is the installation and the technician's time, the physical time that they spend on site doing it. It's also the ancillary support personnel within operations. We are going to have an allocation for the things like dispatch or project management, operations manager. We also have other costs within operations that we typically are going to have. We might have vehicles. We have technician training, perks, benefits. Also, all of the labor load on all these people. When we say labor load, we typically mean those things specifically that come and go if we hire or fire, which is the taxes and benefit, health insurance and the like for those employees. When you run all that together, it typically runs about 62% of sales to buy the equipment from the wholesaler and then pay for all of the costs that run up to our operations department. Sales expense typically is going to run on average across all sales about 18%. And that includes the base pay, the base salary for those salespeople and commissions, the labor load, the taxes and benefits on those folks, sales management. If you happen to have a large enough team that you have a sales manager, we've accounted for that. And then also all the other things that run up under sales expenses, which would be your advertising, your marketing, your sales collateral. You might have little things like cell phone expense for sales or some mileage reimbursements, things like that. But it all runs up into sales expenses. Just in a very simple math, that's how we get our contribution to the 20% number. Now, remember this, we still haven't paid any overhead out of these dollars, but that's okay because we're going to set overhead aside for a minute. We're going to assume that overhead's going to be there whether we sell this stuff or not. What contribution is doing is giving us kind of the ammo to throw at our overhead. When it's all said and done, these types of transactions are probably among the less profitable things that we can do. But later on, if we take the transaction where we don't make a lot of money, but then we actually have it parlayed into a recurring revenue, then it's honestly a good thing. Just to kind of give a little anecdote on TAG, one of the things I've done with the financial analysis is we went in and we looked at all these different companies and analyzed how they've sold these products. And I had one company that I use as an example. And they said, well, I typically sell my systems for a little less, but I get it back with the recurring revenue. I get a partnering plan on it, or I get some aftermarket repair sales. And so I want to get the sales. Maybe I'm breaking even on the sale, but I'm making it up on the recurring side. And that's a common thought. But what we came to find out was that if this person was losing money on this transaction when they sold their surveillance systems and they sold their premise-based telephony, they were losing money and then having to make up quite a bit. And we said, hey, look, if you were to just break even on the transaction, which means make zero money, make nothing, then you would actually have had another $150,000 of profit. Sometimes these transactions can be seen as loss leaders. We don't believe they have to be. We are not going to make a ton of money on them, but we should be able to be certainly profitable. And we don't want to put ourselves into a place where we do have a loss leader where, guess what, we need to spend the next year's worth of recurring revenue making up the amount of money that we lost on the initial transaction. We're going to go through a couple of metrics. I'm going to have plenty of time for you guys to ask questions here. We'll have some discussion on any of these topics as we finish up. One of the things we want to do is we talk about this for 20 years of TAG history is a very simple metric for making sure we pad enough in there to pay for our costs of getting the stuff installed, and is getting a 2.2 markup. What that means is, from our parlance, is that if we buy $10,000 worth of hard cost equipment from a Zoltus, from an NEC, from any other phone dealer, or any type of equipment that you're buying, like Hike Vision for cameras and any of that equipment that comes in, we're typically going to sell it to the end user for around $22,000. Now, not everybody looks at it this way, because what they do is they'll price it up a little bit differently. What we say is, whatever the customer pays, they write you a check for how much money, or maybe it gets put through a lease or whatever, but they're going to buy this system from you. They are going to buy it. How much did they pay? Divided by the equipment cost. Now, the reason I bring this up is I have an example I want to show you is sometimes that we somewhat talk past each other. Let's say that I'll use Mike and Courtney here because they're one of the 4 or 5 that I can see on my little windows here. But Mike and Courtney, you guys each own a different company. Let's say you meet at a trade show or you meet at an industry event. And Courtney, you say to Michael, hey, what do you typically do on these big surveillance or phone systems? And Mike says, you know what? I mark mine up, the equipment, I mark it up a 1.5, and then I add my labor on top of that to get to my sale price. Courtney says, gosh, I've always done it where I mark it up a 1.7, take my $10,000 and I charge 17, and then I add my labor on top of it. And Mike, you walk away from that going, gosh, she must be able to get a much better price in her market. Maybe I'm underpriced. Maybe I'm leaving money on the table. And what we've said is not to get into those weeds, because it really doesn't matter how we get to that price. And I'll show you this quick example. How we arrive at that price doesn't matter. If we talk past each other, Mike and Courtney, you guys end up walking away thinking, Courtney's thinking, gosh, he must be getting less for his phone systems or his surveillance projects than I am. Mike thinks he's getting less, but at the end of the day, it might not be the case. Let's just use a simple markup. Let's just say a 2.0. We bought a system wholesale from our provider for $10,000, and we're going to sell it for 20. That's a 2.0 markup by our standards. Let's say in this scenario, you have somebody that works their way up to the price by saying, hey, I do a 1.5 on equipment, and I'm going to estimate it's going to take 30 hours to install this system. And my retail rate, again, just to use very simple math, is $100 an hour. That's $3,000 of labor for the install. I add a couple grand for configuration and training, and I end up at $20,000. That would be the Courtney in this situation. Michael comes around, he says, well, that would be Michael in that situation, scenario one. Courtney is saying, gosh, I am getting a 1.7 on my equipment, and then I add labor, so I must be in better shape, should I not? Actually, no. What if they are actually using something different for the labor estimate? It's still 30 hours, but what if she is using a loaded internal labor rate of $50 an hour, which is a loaded cost? Now I have 30 hours times 50, not 100, so she's only adding $1,500 for her labor. She adds another something on top of that for the configuration and training, but she gets to $20,000 the same way, right? And then you have a third option where somebody just says, hey, I don't really try to get into that. I just take the equipment and I'm charging usually about $20,000. That would be a 2.0 markup. In our parlance here, we don't care how you got there. If the customer pays 20 and the wholesale cost was 10, that's a 2.0. Don't care how you got there. We want to make sure that when we are saying mark, we are not talking about labor, we are not talking about equipment or some combination of those two differently. We're really just looking at one item, which is how much did the customer pay? What was the end price that they were invoiced for, divided by our wholesale cost. What we recommend, and this has been true for 20 years since the inception of TAG, is that if we can average a 2.2, we are going to be in pretty good shape to make a 20% contribution on that sale. Now, notice how I did not say we have to beat a 2.2 on every single sale. When we say we average, do we break rate occasionally? We sure do. But if we can get a little bit better price occasionally, say we break rate, we go down to a 2.1 or a 2.0 once in a while on a competitive deal, we want to get the sale. Occasionally, we might need to get a 2.3 or 4 if the market will allow, because ideally, if we have a large volume of these types of system sales, we are going to need to average about a 2.2 if we want to put 20% to the bottom line. Here's the first kind of real metric I want you guys to understand is we don't want to discount that 2.2. If we can avoid it, if we have to discount, how are we going to make it up on another sale so that we can still average a 2.2 is super important. This is the primary thing we want to make sure you guys understand is that if you lower the price by 10%, that is going to almost cut your contribution in half. The amount of money that you're going to have kind of in your cash register before overhead, we still need to pay overhead, is going to be decreased by half if we just lower the price by 10 points. How often do you have it happen where, for those of you with salespeople, depending on what they're selling and how they're selling it, they might come to you and say, hey, I've got this big deal, we're going to get it, but it's real competitive. If we lower the price by 10%, we'll get the deal. 10% doesn't seem like a lot. So you as a sales manager, as an owner, kind of have to understand what the impact on the contribution is going to be to decide, do you take that deal or not? I have this example, and again, we're using very, very simple examples of a small system, $10,000. What happens when we do that discount? Because that happens a lot. A 10% price discount on a large project typically seems like something we can absorb. This is my example, and notice how I say it's as good as it gets. The reason for this is because the numbers I'm going to show you are what the folks who are putting in a fair amount of volume in the surveillance and premise-based voice, these are the best numbers that you get. This is not an average case. This is the best of the best. The 80-20 rule is here. The probably 1 out of 5 tag members that's selling these types of large fixed price systems is going to be able to achieve these numbers. There's a lot of ways these numbers could get worse and costs could be higher, but there's not a lot of ways for these numbers to be any better than this. So let's see how it goes. And I just heard something in the background a little bit. Was somebody trying to ask a question, or was that just background noise? Let's say you have equipment cost, you're buying your system, whether it's surveillance or voice, and it's coming out, it's going to cost you about $4,500 to buy the equipment. You're going to buy the parts and pieces, you're going to buy the cameras, you're going to buy the DVR, you're going to buy the handsets and PBX if it's a premise-based voice system. Anyway, it's going to cost $4,500. In a 2.2 scenario, you're going to charge 10 grand. In a 2.0, you're only going to charge $9,000. And again, it's not uncommon to see something that you're looking to get 10 grand for, you go ahead and get the sale at $9,000. And this is something that it doesn't seem like a lot. We have labor to install. All the things that I mentioned before, we have project management, engineering, dispatch, training. We have the labor load on all those folks. We have vehicles and some other things like technician perks and training that will come into this. But this is me estimating about 27 hours of time. Plus, we always kind of pad the estimate by 25%. And this is something we'll get into when we talk a little bit more about hourly labor efficiency, is that we know come hell or high water, we're lucky if we get 75% uptime overall. So whenever I build a labor profile, we're always going to add a few more hours. We'll get into that a little bit later, but it's just to let you know how we came up with that. The other folks that are in operations, project manager, operations manager, dispatcher, those kinds of employees that you have in ops typically run about 50% on average over the course of an entire year with all the volume that we might do, about half of the cost of whatever our payroll is for the technician side. So then you add all this up, and what do you get? Well, the cost of goods to buy the equipment and pay the folks who put it in is $6,200 either way. The fact that we lowered the price obviously doesn't make it any cheaper for us to buy it or put it in. We're going to have the same cost of goods no matter what. Let's look at sales expenses. Well, actually, first we'll talk margins. If the cost of goods stays the same and we charge $1,000 less on the top end, what are we going to have? We're going to have about $1,000 less in gross margin. Instead of $3,800 in just straight gross margin, we're only going to have $2,800. Makes sense because we're charging $1,000 less. Now I have the sales expense. I'm going to have commission. I'm going to have sales management, labor load, car allowance, sell, advertising. These are kind of allocations on just a very simple one-time deal. And these are based on when I look at all the systems that are sold over the course of a year, and I have an allocation for these costs, we allocate every dollar of cost that comes in the case. Most of the time when we're doing this, we look at, hey, what's my cost to buy the system? And oh, it's going to take 27 hours to install. What's my cost there? And that's how we calculate whether a deal is profitable. When we look at all your sales over the course of a year, we don't leave anything off the table. But for the sake of this example, our sales expenses are basically the same. We might pay a little bit less in commissions because the sale price is less, but for everything else, those costs are going to really stay the same. And for sales management, this is one example here that if you're paying a sales manager 80 grand a year roughly, and you're doing $2 million of voice and surveillance system sales, this is how much you actually have to allocate for that sales management. A lot of folks are not doing that much in volume. So this is one example where, sure, if you're not doing that volume, then the cost of the sales manager is actually going to be higher than this. So again, this goes back to these numbers are as good as it gets. We see very rarely does anybody do any better than this. Let's see what happens here. Well, we've got cost of goods. We know that we're going to have about $1,000 less in gross margin, we pay the sales expense, and we get to our contribution, and our contribution is $1,100. It's almost 50% of what we would have made if we would have charged full price. That 10% price discount is come directly out of our, let's call it our operating profit, which is contribution of the buying and selling of our goods and services before we pay for any overhead. And what I typically do with salespeople, I actually do a webinar occasionally for salespeople to kind of explain for those that are selling these type of systems to run through this exact example. And typically what I find, and for those of you with a sales background or anybody that's been on that side of the fence, if they're not aware of the economics of the business, they can do this with anything. They do it with copiers, they can do it with IT, where they basically think that, hey, I want to lower this price 10%, and I'm willing to take 10% less commission to get the deal. And for that, they think I'm taking a haircut, the company's getting 10% less, but I'm willing to take 10% less commission, so we're about even. The salesperson is thinking they're doing us a favor by bringing this in, and it's still a good sale, there's nothing wrong with it, but 10% less to the company versus 10% less commission, we're not even here. It's not that the company's taking a bit of a haircut and so is the salesperson. Salesperson's losing out on $100 and the company is taking $900, almost half of that contribution away. And so this is something that they need to know. Now, what have we not paid yet? Contribution is the money we have left over before we have any overhead allocation. And if we have an overhead allocation, the best in the business here, we typically don't see any overhead getting less than 15% of sales. Again, a simple example shows here, even the best in the business, they get 20% contribution. Once we have an allocation for overhead, which is all of our admin staff, rent, utilities, insurance, all that stuff, we've only got $500 left over out of a $10,000 sale. This is kind of what I was saying is these are not the transactions themselves that we're going to make a ton of money on. But look what happens on the right when we lower the price to $9,000. We're upside down. When I do this example for the salespeople, I typically will run through this and I'll ask them, I'll say, okay, so you all get it? You see what's happened here? Now, knowing what you know now, Mr. Salesperson, would you take this deal? Would you still do this deal for $9,000? And they kind of suspect that it's a trick question, or they're like, well, no, you just showed me, Tim, that we're going to lose $400 on this transaction. Of course not, duh. You're kind of baiting me in here. And the answer actually is well, it depends, unfortunately. So it kind of is a trick question because your overhead is fixed, is it not? If I look at this as a single transaction, I really want to look at contribution because, okay, on this one deal, I have $1,100 that I didn't have before, correct? I have $1,100 to kind of throw towards my overhead. You as the owner might say, it's a little lighter than we would like to have, but I'll still take it. It's still $1,100. But you might not make the same decision if this was a $100,000 deal where any one of a number of things might be able to go wrong. And it might be, gosh, if we have any hiccups in the installation or if we have any issues, we could very easily be breaking even at a contribution level before we pay overhead. You might choose to not take it. But the difference is, if you remember kind of the last thing we said last week to tie this in, is remember how we said contribution helps you make short-term decisions. Do I take this one deal today or not is a short-term decision. I might say, you know what? It's not as much money as I would like, but $1,100 is $1,100. Let's do it. Having an understanding of contribution helps me make that decision. What's the problem here? If I sell every system I sell over the course of a year and I sell them all at a 2.0, if I sell them all at a 2.0, I'm going to make roughly 11% contribution, and I am going to have 15% assigned as overhead. And so on the whole, when I make that allocation of overhead across all of my business lines, the sale of these systems is now underwater. So that's the difference between the short-term consideration of, do I take this deal today? Or what happens if I price a discount into every single deal and I end up breaking rate a lot more often than I would like to? Then all of a sudden I'm not making money on these transactions. Now again, recurring revenue comes into the mix. You're going to have some aftermarket sale potentially of service labor, or you might put them on a partner plan for that large surveillance system or prem voice, but that's separate. So ultimately, if we're going to have this transaction, should we make money or not? We don't want to be a loss leader. And if we price every sale at around a 2.0, typically we are going to have a deficit of profitability that we're going to have to make up before we really are going to be profitable on the recurring, because we'll have that hole that we have to dig ourselves out of. Does this all make sense to everybody? This is really what we wanted to show, the difference between that contribution on a single deal and what happens if we price every deal underpriced, improperly priced at a 2.0 or a 1.9. We're going to end up upside down, are we not? What we say is, does it mean you can't break rate? No, it doesn't mean that. It means you can, but we also need to take advantage of, if we have the opportunity to quote out a deal or two at a 2.3 to even it out, so we still average a 2.2, then we should be in good shape. The next thing we're going to talk about real briefly is salesperson expense. And I will go through this kind of briefly, like I said, because when it comes to compensation, we sell a ton of different products. We have different comp plans for different disciplines, whether it's voice or IT or the copier side. We have, within those, we have recurring sales, we have product sales. So there's obviously a lot of ways to skin this cat. And there's also a lot of ways that we can make it right, and a lot of ways we can do it wrong. And we could probably do a whole session on just how do we compensate salespeople on all these different products. Absolutely. It's a long conversation, and it is I guess, one that's like trying to hold the ocean back with a broom. There is no perfect way to do it, and we keep talking about it year in and year out. For this discipline, when we're selling large fixed price products for a contract bid price, we need to keep our salesperson expense direct compensation. This is not labor load or any of the other advertising budgets or anything like that, but the direct compensation to the salesperson ideally is going to be 10% of the amount of revenue that we brought in. And we want to make sure that when we look at all of our sales across the course of, let's say in system sales, we do $1 million. How much compensation did we pay for that $1 million? Ideally, we would like to see the base plus commission somewhere be in the ballpark of 10% of that $1 million or $100,000. We want to reward performance, not mediocrity here. And what does that mean? This is one thing that I want to show an example of why we don't pay anybody on a draw anymore. That was very popular years and years ago, where you'd have some salespeople that would have a draw, but if they were good, they were typically getting commission only if they were outselling that draw. Can't really do that anymore. We're pretty much in this position now where we really got to pay base pay plus commission. It's difficult to make that work unless that person is very productive, which means we have to have minimums, or we potentially don't pay commissions on the first X dollars. I can, again, talk to you about that if you want to have a conversation. But what happens is, if we do base plus commission, we end up over rewarding the underperformers. And those non-performers can hurt your business. So I want to give this example to kind of show you what we mean by that. Let's say you have salesperson 1 and salesperson 2. I'll pick on Courtney again. Courtney, you are salesperson 1. You are a rock star. You're the best salesperson this company's ever had. Salesperson 2, that's me. My background is in accounting and finance. I couldn't sell my way out of a wet paper bag, but I'm selling enough to not get fired, which we have salespeople that are kind of like that. They're not selling nothing, but they're not really selling enough that we really feel like they're paying for themselves. So let's say, Courtney, you're doing great. You're selling $1 million a year of these large systems. Let's say that's your focus. You don't sell anything else. You sold $1 million last year. I sold 300,000. We're both making around 5 points, let's say, that's on this particular project. Not saying that that's the recommended commission structure, but if somebody's making 5% of $1 million, you're going to get a commission of 50 grand. I'm going to make my much less compensation of 15,000, 5% of my sales. And then we have total compensation here of $95,000 versus 60, which kind of makes sense. They sold more, so they should certainly be making more money than me because I'm not selling that much. But the question is now is what's wrong with this picture? And can anybody chime in here? What do they see as wrong with what we just showed here with the sales for these two salespeople in terms of their compensation? Does anybody want to guess?
I could guess, but it's not fair.
Yeah. Paul, you've seen this before.
Yeah, I have.
Should the first salesperson be making significantly more?
Well, yeah. I mean, it seems like, yeah, they should be making more because this is the problem. I've got 3 times the sales and you're only paying, Courtney, you should be pissed off here. I sold 3 times as much as Tim, but I'm only getting 50% roughly more money. If I sell 3 times as much, I'm only going to make 50% more compensation than somebody who's just phoning it in. That's not fair. That's the problem with paying a base pay, plus then you pay commission on the first dollar of the first sale they have, they start making commission. The underperformers hurt your business. Why? Well, let's look at this from a cost of sales. In Courtney's case, my total compensation, which is direct compensation, not including labor load and not including any other sales costs, I'm paying 9.5% of the sales she bought in as my sales expense. I'm paying 20% of Tim's sales. And that is, if you look at the model we just went through, if I was paying 20% of sales, I'm upside down on that business. Not saying you can't pay a base. We've kind of resigned ourselves to the fact that we have to pay a base, but we need to make sure that those people that we pay a base to are going to be more like Courtney and less like Tim. It's very difficult to be profitable when you look at an individual person's sales and you add their base plus their commission and you divide that by the amount of sales that they were personally responsible for over that same period. If they're not performing, it's easy for that number to be 20, 25, 30%. If somebody's making 60 grand and they only brought in $180,000, that happens. And it could be because the salesperson's new and they're getting ramped up, but they need to get on the stick pretty good. So the higher the base pay that's fixed, the more important it is we make sure that those folks get up and running, and they need to be at the high level of production pretty quick. We don't want to have this go on for 2 years and somebody's still kind of barely selling enough to keep their job. Understand, when you pay a person a base pay, this is what happens. The key metric here is we want, and again, this is not for every sale you're going to make across every discipline. For this type of transaction, and we will break it out for you if you're a company that sells these types of surveillance and premise voice transactions, is that we want to make sure we keep the base plus commission hopefully around 10% or less than the total sales that they brought in. We have a $100,000 a year guy and he's responsible for bringing in $1 million of sales. That's about kind of the metric we want to be at. Now in IT, it probably creeps up to about 12. That's something we'll get into when we talk about the IT business. But that's kind of one of the things. What I've seen here is the folks that are not making 20% contribution on these types of sales. One of the things that can be hurting them is the compensation to the salesperson. We always think the cost of, yeah.
And we like to say when we were talking about the new reps and the ramp up, we let them steal from us for 6 months. And then if they don't give the money back, then we fire them.
Exactly. And that's the thing is you can't continue to pay a high base with somebody who's just kind of barely productive. And that's what you kind of have to do. You do have to fish or cut bait pretty quick, because when you hire a bad salesperson, not a bad person, but they're not very productive, let's say, if you end up having to fire them, that's typically a $40,000 to $60,000 cost to you by the time you've paid them and spent all the time with their training and everything else. Even if you cut them quickly, it's still typically a $40,000 to $60,000 mistake, unfortunately, when you add it all up. The next thing is the cost of the technicians. We always think, oh gosh, our technicians must be, if we're not making money when we're selling these, it must be we're inefficient in our delivery. We're inefficient in our installation. And so what we found is that the cost of the technicians really only has a moderate impact of the overall profitability, although we certainly still have to manage it. And the example I want to use to point this out is let's go back to that model that I just showed you. See that $960 of estimated labor. What if we have the worst install we could possibly have, and we blow the install because one thing goes wrong after another, and we miss this projection by 50%. We spend 50% more hours than we should. That's a disaster. That's about as worse as it could possibly get. How much money would it cost us if we were to blow the install by 50%? Well, half of 960, it would cost us an additional $480. That's the impact to me if we were to wreck the installation and just have one, kind of the Murphy's Law of installations, where everything that could go wrong does go wrong. It's going to cost us $480. How much did it cost us by lowering the price 10%? That cost us $900. If we were overpaying our salesperson and our cost was 15% instead of 10, that cost us $500. What I mean to put here is that the cost of the technicians is important, but we hurt ourselves a heck of a lot more by lowering the price on these sales. And again, it's not every sale. We do get competitive when we have to be, but we have to still be able to average that certain price point if we want to be profitable. And kind of the thought here is, if you're perfect on the installation and you have your sales expense controlled, you're still not going to make money if you are priced incorrectly. Whereas the opposite is true. If you're doing well with keeping price integrity, you can kind of mess up a lot of things. Have the installation not be perfect. You can maybe pay a little extra on the sales expense, and you'll still be profitable. It's just when we lower our price, we do a 1.8, 1.9, 2.0 on average. Gosh, that makes it very, very difficult. We can be perfect everywhere else and still not make money. Last metric here is 6 hours per $1,000 of equipment. We tried to find, what was the one dividing line here, and it's really, when we talk about technicians and how much time we should spend, it's 6 hours per $1,000 of wholesale purchased equipment, not the price that you're charging the customer. It's, we have to buy this equipment, and we found that the correlation between the wholesale cost of this equipment and the amount of labor it takes to install it is precisely regular. And this is over years and years and years. It's never really deviated. 6 hours per $1,000 of equipment. And I'll show you an example of how that works. The labor hours used divided by the equipment it cost divided by 1,000. Essentially, how many hours do we take to install each $1,000 of equipment? We're going to take this metric, is something we can easily do if we sell these types of systems, is to track the installation hours. We log it in ConnectWise, we log it in AutoTask, we log it in TigerPaw, we log it in eAutomate, and ideally we have the ability to say, hey, how many hours did our technicians log for these types of installations? Surveillance installations, how many hours did we put forth? If you can't get that information, we can probably help you try to tweak your system. You need to make sure you can pull this so you know how many hours are being spent on what type of activity. Obviously very important. Let's just say, let's take an example. Q1 on my P&L, and again, this is great because it's not rocket science, it's not this crazy algorithm. We have two numbers that are readily available to you on your P&L or out of your TigerPaw. The first one is P&L. I pull Q1. Q1, what does it say? Cost of goods for surveillance or voice, whatever, whichever one it is. I bought $200,000 worth of product. It's on my P&L. I don't have to do any crazy calculations. It's right there. I look in TigerPaw or ConnectWise or whichever your PSA is, and it says that my technicians told me that they spent 1,500 hours on site to deploy that same $200,000 worth of equipment. Question, is this good or bad? How do we figure out, are we hitting the metric or not? Is 1,500 hours the right amount of budgeted time to install $200,000 worth of equipment? Really, this is kind of how we do it, is we'll say $200,000 divide by 1,000 because we want the units to be in for every $1,000 of equipment. We have 200 of those. Then I'm going to divide my 1,500 hours by 200. What does it give me? I am spending 7.5 man hours for every $1,000 of equipment. And again, this is a metric, like a lot of our metrics, it's not necessarily a every single day, every single week, or every single deal metric. What we typically do is we take a quarter or even 2 quarters and say, okay, with the good installs, the bad installs, the sideways installs, the great installs, things that everything went right, the ones that everything went wrong, on average, we should still be around 6 hours. What happens is this, we're looking at this as a metric, and INET tracks this every quarter like clockwork to see that they're in line, and you can just basically pull this in about 10 seconds as long as you have access to the data and say, hey, guess what, Q1, 7.5 hours. If all of last year was right around 6, that's strange. What's happening? Is there a problem? Is there something to look into? Do we have some inefficiency in the installations? We may look into it, and maybe there was one large installation that was just a complete monster that sucked up all of our time. It could be any number of reasons. Typically, when I'm looking at this, I'm looking at all of your installations over the entire year and doing this exact same calculation, saying, hey, good, bad, or indifferent, there's always a one-off people want to point to, but over the course of a year, if your average is higher than 6, then we would say that you have some excess capacity in this department. You have a little bit of overstaffing. Okay, I think we're getting towards the end here. I want to have some time for questions. This is, again, one of the simplest things we do is these fixed price projects. We're going to build on this as we go towards looking at recurring revenue, more complex transactions, getting into IT. This is one of the simpler ones. Pretty simple, these premise voice, and again, we're going to talk hosted. Hosted is a completely different animal. The premise voice solution, the large surveillance or physical security system should contribute 20% before overhead. How do we get there? Well, we need to price it properly. We need to make sure we're controlling our sales expense. And we need to ensure that we've hit the metric of 6 hours per $1,000 of equipment. That is about how much time we should be spending on average to install this type of transaction. And obviously, each individual transaction is going to be up, down, or sideways, but on average, all those should even out. And if we can average that 6 hours, we're usually doing pretty good. And at the end of the day, if we're doing everything right, we're going to have all of 5% left over after overhead. That assumes that we make 20% contribution, and the best among us maybe have 15% in overhead allocation. A lot of us in TAG have 18, 20, 22, depending on your scale, depending on your size, depending on how much volume you do, and whether or not you need a lot of space for what you do, for facilities and things like that. So everybody's overhead's a little different. But the best among us are only putting up 5%. What we're going to do next week is we're going to talk about how much ungodly money we can make by putting a combination of these transactions with a recurring revenue source that we have very detailed out that really can help build a nice recurring revenue for you to attach to these transactions. Let me just end it there, and I will open it up to questions.
So the deployed labor, is that referring just to basically hourly technicians that are actually performing the install?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So you're leaving out any other project management, et cetera?
No, this is just for the actual deployment and what we define as deployment, and we'll get into, there's a definition in this next class that we'll talk about, actually, or the one that's week after next. But we talk about what do we mean by how many hours. To us, deployed time means that the employee is there on site doing the install. They could be doing something remotely, let's say, if we call that deployed, if somebody's doing remote remediation or whatever. But if they're on site doing the work, they're doing something remotely doing the work, they're spending the time stocking the truck and getting all the parts and pieces organized and ready to deploy, or they're actually in travel time. All those hours will typically go into this, not just the hours spent on site, but all the prep time and everything else. And we'll define that in a future class. That's a good question, Mike. All right. Any other questions?
Is the 6 hours per $1,000, is that just for voice? So,
These are for fixed price projects. So it's not for IT projects where it's kind of a, typically we bill by the hour because it's very hard to fix a price in an IT solution. And we typically don't do that. In these cases, it would be premise-based voice, large systems where you're installing all the handsets, you're doing all the, getting everything in the wall, you're installing and configuring a PBX in their server room, and it's all housed on site. Or it is a large, surveillance or security, physical security system. So you're thinking surveillance cameras, sometimes larger facilities, you can have hundreds of cameras. And you're basically saying, I'm going to install your cameras for $70,000. You do not get to get $75,000 if you end up having a little difficulty in your installation, and you typically don't give the customer a discount if it turns out it was easier than you thought. You're basically committing to that $70,000 price. Doesn't matter if it's good, bad, or indifferent. And so that's the precise scenario, surveillance and voice, where we're doing these large premise-based installations. That makes sense?
Mhm.
For any other type of sale, like the recurring revenue we get from partner plans, labor sold by the hour, parts and pieces sold, just not with the installation, those carry different economic triggers than this. This is a unique piece where we're really talking about the surveillance and voice installations where that price is fixed. Okay, any other questions? Okay, I'm going to let you go, and we will have this recording posted. I believe Janet will also send out these slides. If you think of any questions after the fact, after we get off here, if anything comes to mind, feel free to just email me or give me a call. I'm happy to take any questions after these sessions end as well. So thanks a lot, guys, and have a nice rest of your day.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.